Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great privilege to sit on the stage with these two men. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. This is a historical event that we're trying to uh, recapture over and over again, where we get people who've done big things in their lives in the military and combat situations to tell other people about it at air shows just like this. About 30 years ago, I had the opportunity to meet someone who had flown in World War One. Now, I got interested in aviation because I loved the open cockpit biplanes and the fight of Eddie Rickenbacker. I just loved the guy. And here I get at a party and I meet someone who had fought alongside Eddie Rickenbacker, and I got to talk to him for 4 hours. That is one of the greatest gifts I've ever received in my life. And these two gentlemen will give you that opportunity when we get off the stage to come up and talk with them. But we've also got one of the four living aces that are left in the United States here: Chuck de Bellevue, J.B. Stone, General McInerney, legends across the board. And we'll have a World War II B-17 and gentlemen here, and a C-47 man walking and riding through the aisleways here shortly. If you get a chance, please walk up to them, kick them in the shins, and ask them to tell you your story, their story. It's just incredible. So, a little background on the Misty facts. The F-100 was a single-engine airplane. By and large, it was a single cockpit mission. But in the Misty world, they decided to pair a front seater and a back seater up together and go out and troll in large measure for sometimes AAA, but looking down low for trucks and logistical supply lines that they could take out. And because they were flying so low, they got shot at a lot. And the risk associated with jumping into this program were known to both of you. So why in the world would you have joined the Misty Fact program? What would cause you to do that? General Fogelman?
The answer to that question is really not very complex in the sense. Um, when you're in the fighter business, you want to be where the action is. And for an F-100 pilot, most of our time was spent in South Vietnam, flying close air support, flying missions in support of the Army, which was an important mission. But we also had guys who were flying up in North Vietnam, and it was a different arena. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit geopolitical here. The problem that we had was, as we got into the war in Vietnam, their supplies came in from sea and came down a railroad from China. And for political reasons, we were not allowed to strike those targets. We could have stopped the flow of material that was coming in through those ways if we would have done it at the source. But because of political constraints, this stuff was loaded onto trucks, and then these trucks were traveling down to South Vietnam to support the forces in South Vietnam, the Vietnamese. So we needed a way to interdict and stop that flow of goods. And initially, we sent our slow-moving facts up into the southern part of northern Vietnam, and it was so heavily defended that their attrition rate was too high. So they came up with this idea of taking the two-seat F-100 and moving it up there. It was faster, and we would have two people in the airplane, and the survivability would go up. And it did. The survivability went up, and the effectiveness was there. We never stopped the flow of things going to South Vietnam, but we impeded them. And so if you were an F-100 pilot in South Vietnam and you were looking for a little bit of excitement, you would volunteer to go to Misty. And the average tour up there was about 4 months long. And we can talk about some of the statistics later. But the fact of the matter is we had a lot of airplanes shot down. And so it was kind of the challenge from my perspective. I had known the first commander, Bud Day, and then his wife, Dory Day, had been a friend of my wife out at Luke Air Force Base. And we had kind of known the stories about how it was started. So from the time I got to Vietnam, I was trying to do the things I needed to do to make it qualifications to be a Misty Fac, and I volunteered to do that. That was my reason.
General Detwiler?
I had a little more personal reason. In my career in the Air Force, I was an instructor in everything I flew, and including the F-100. There were three types of folks in the F-100. There were guys that had been in it forever. And then there was a group of senior captains, junior majors that came from Europe and had spent 3 years taking check rides and finally becoming flight leads, qualified flight leads and instructors. And then there were bonehead lieutenants like myself who had just come out of Luke. I had a total of about 240 hours. And a good friend of mine who also went to Misty, were camped in these little Porta camp trailers with a guy from Misty. And he sat at the other end and he would tell us night after night, you don't know what's going on up there. You're just wasting your time. You belong up there. And finally it tore us down. So I went to join Misty, and I'm over talking. And Misty, I was fortunate. I was based in the 416 at Phuket. So I heard these guys. I hung with these guys and I wanted to be part of it. And I asked Dick Rutan one day, can I be a Misty? He said, are you a flight lead? And I said, I've got 400 hours. I'm not a flight lead. He said, well, you got to be a flight lead. So I go back to the squadron commander the next day, a guy named Scott. Like, sir, I'd like to go to Misty, but I need to be a flight lead. And it was one of these younger captains there saying, you can't teach him like that for an hour. And the colonel looks at him and said, you want to go to Misty? No. Okay. So I'm the flight lead. He signs a paper, and I'm the flight lead. And I go back over and I'm talking to Wells Jackson. He said, well, you have to be an instructor pilot because when you're sitting in the back, you have to be in the log pilot time. And if you're not an instructor pilot. So I go back over to the squadron commander and I'm there again. And I said, sir, I need to be an instructor pilot. And again, he can't. They signed it in. So with 2 swoops of the pen, I'm an instructor pilot and a flight lead with 400 hours. And I joined Misty thinking, this is pretty cool. And that's how I got it. It's like General Fogelman said, it was a challenge. This is something tougher than what we were doing, and we're going to give it a shot.
So this is a different mission than flying strike missions uprange. You're a forward air controller, which you're calling in airstrikes. You're finding, fixing, and then calling in airstrikes. Certainly, you got a lot of training for that, right, beforehand. It wasn't a on-the-job training deal. And I would imagine because it was a pairing between the front seat and the back seat, that combination, how well you operated together and who was in the other airplane really made a difference. Could you talk to the training?
Let me talk to the training. What you've described is a really neat program. Unfortunately, it didn't exist. So the training program was once you got to Misty, you flew your first 5 rides in the back seat. And after the first 5 rides, then you would alternate every mission. One mission you'd be in the front, the other mission you'd be in the back. So my training, when I got up there, Rosie was talking about the fact that he was assigned from Phuket. This was an air base called Phuket. It's where we were operating out of. He was there, so he was a permanent party guy. Half of the Misties, at any one time we had about 16 pilots. We flew 6 sorties a day. So you had Misty 1-1, 2-1, right through 6-1. And so just to maintain the schedule, you needed 12 pilots a day. And like I say, there was normally 15 or 16 of us there. If somebody got sick or something, you could end up logging a lot of time. So my checkout, when I went up there, I was replacing somebody from Venable Air Base, which is where I had been. And he flew me on my first Misty ride. And basically what the first Misty ride was about was to take you up and get you familiar with the area. And one of the biggest challenges we had were guns. AAA, everything from 50 caliber, 23, 37, 54, all that. And believe it or not, the Misties had certain guns that they used for training aids. These guys were so bad that we told people never kill that gun because it's a training aid. And so on this particular day, the guy I'm replacing is taking me through the training aids. And we're up there and we're making this one turn, and he's telling me, look down there, that's a 23 millimeter. See how they shoot? They fire off these rounds, and then the gun barrel kind of loads up, and it gives you a puff of smoke. They're self-marking. That's a 23 millimeter. So I'm down there, I'm trying to see this 23 millimeter. All of a sudden, boom! And this guy says, geez, what was that? And I said, geez, what was that? And it turned out to be a gun that wasn't a trained gun that took a shot at us. And but that's how you learn the area, you learn the guns, and our job was to find targets. The guy in the back was normally responsible for briefing the target location, elevation. What we called was the 9 line. He would go through that whole thing. And then the guy in the front was responsible for coming down the chute. We carried marking rockets, so we had 14 of them. And he would mark the target, and then you would put the flight in. Flight leaves, you'd go down and look for battle damage assessment. Were we successful in doing what we were doing? So that was really kind of the training, if you will. It was on the job training. And I'll leave it at that. Rosie, you may have something to say about that.
Well, again, with the guns being the biggest threat, about halfway through my tour there, they announced that the battleship New Jersey was in the South China Sea and would be coming to help us. And we're sitting there thinking, man, this is going to be wonderful. We can have these guys offshore, and we just pinpoint the location, stay out of the way, and we'll be taking gun sights out. So as it turned out, I was one of the first guys to work at New Jersey, and the call sign was onrush. So before I go any further, any Deepwater Navy guys here? Stick with me to the end of the story, okay? So onrush, and they always seem to have a deep voice about Mr. Long March, we're ready to, and he gives you the lineup, and he's going to shoot a Willie Pete. Now, the weight phosphorus marking rockets that we had on the F-100 were about 50 pounds, and the warhead, the weight phosphorus, was about 5 pounds. And he says, we'll be firing a 600-pound Willie Pete. And we're going, oh my God, I gotta see this thing at San Francisco. So he fires it, we give him the coordinates, he fires it, and a little plop hits the water, and about a mile offshore, and that's terrible. And guys went on for about 2 or 3 weeks. You got to be, we're working on us, but now you're still getting shot at, marking for this guy, and he can't hit anything. And we had the ops officer in the back seat when they had him there, and we get the common swing back fleet. The board would like to know what the PDA was, and he had trying to hit a loading dock near the Ron River, had missed and put 4 rounds in the water, 4 rounds of fire. And the ops officer goes, well, you managed to miss the entire continent region. So they were having a tough time with the onrush. And finally, one night I'm in the bunk, and my roommate wakes me up and he says, I got it. I know what's wrong. I said, what's wrong with what? It's like 2 a.m. He says, with the battleship, it's the maps. Because these guys were firing support missions in the south, and we bring them up north and they can't hit the continent. So Chris Kellum goes out, his name was Chris Kellum, he goes out the next day and says, can you track me with your guns? And he says, yes. I said, okay, that's all I need to know. So he briefs the next day with a young Irish kid named Bob Fitzsimmons, and a young mean Irish kid, as we found out, named Bob Fitzsimmons. And Bob's there, so he says, we're going to work onrush day. He said, how are we going to do it? They shoot at us. And he actually had them track him with radar guns. And when he said fire, they fired at Chris. He pulled up. It's a 25-second, 30-second flight, so he was well out of the way. And he got what any Army guys are doing. They call it a straddle, which means some of your shots were short, some were long, fire for effect. And he took a bridge approach out with the onrush. I always thought that was a neat story about Chris and figuring out what was wrong, because we were putting visual strikes in. You put a visual strike in, they can see what they're hitting, and you then pass the Saigon the wrong coordinates. Well, nobody cares because they hit it. But when you're trying to strike coordinates, they had to be accurate.
That's awesome. So fighter sorties are notoriously short, unless you go out and you hit a tanker, refuel in the air, an hour and a half, something like that, depending on the mission. But you guys didn't fly an hour and a half. Could you talk about what kind of a classic Misty Fact mission was like?
Yeah,
First of all, we flew 6 missions a day, 1-1 through 6-1, and they were nominally going to be at least 2 hours long because you were going to try and cover the daylight hours, if you will. And there was actually a period of time when we were experimenting with some early infrared stuff that we flew 7-1 missions. But the typical profile is you would get up, get briefed by the intel folks, you go out to the airplane, standard pre-flight, take off, go north, and you would go into the area and do some visual reconnaissance, depending on what was going on. We did a lot of support of rescue operations too, and I can talk about that kind of profile. But you would go in and have a short visual reconnaissance thing. It was like being a detective. For instance, you're over in Laos and there's lots of rivers, and you're trying to determine where the trucks are parked during the day so that you can get guys to come in and strike these truck parks. So one of the things you would do is you would start flying up the road, and during the night is when they were moving, and if there was water splashed up on the south side of a river crossing or a ford, you knew that they were moving south from that point. And so then you would go down to the next river and see, was the water still on the bottom or on the south side, or was it now on the north side? If it was on the north side, you knew that there were trucks somewhere between those 2 rivers. And you generally knew where they liked to park, and then it was a question of going in and getting down and finding them. So that was a little bit of, how we went about this, if you will, in terms of that. But so you would go in the morning sortie, the first thing, try to determine that, and then you would go up and hit a tanker. Then you would air refuel, come back into the area, and by then you would have flights of fighters that were inbound that you were going to put in on targets. We had some sort of perpetual targets, but then if you happen to have found a truck park, or maybe a truck broke down out in the open, something like that, you could put them in. So you work that generally for another hour or so. You go back up by the tanker. By then, maybe 2-1 was starting to come into the area, so you're getting a little overlap. You go up to the tanker, refuel again, come down, do some more recce, put in some more flights, and then you would head back to Phuket to recover. And that's how we kind of overlapped, if you will, during that period of time. And I'll let Rosie talk, but I'll talk about one of the most gratifying missions that we had was to try and help on rescue missions. And I'll talk about that later if you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So normally we were in the area and we were putting in strike flights. And in the course of a strike flight being put in, occasionally they would get hit. And they would have to eject. And so we were the people who normally saw where they came down. And so as soon as the guy was going to bail out of his airplane, the airborne command and control folks would scramble the SAR forces to start moving the search and rescue guys toward us. And our job then was to, if there were any guns in that area, we're to try and kill the guns before the A-1s and the helicopters got in there. And if we had done that, when they arrived, then normally the A-1 Sandy lead would take command. And from that on, we would just circle in case any other guns came up, and they would come in and do the close-in suppression to be able to get the pilot out. So that was kind of how a typical mission would go. But if somebody got shot down at just about dusk, then, the advice was go down, stay down, we'll be back at first light. And that was probably one of the most emotional things that you could have, because what they would do is they would take the guy who saw the shoot down, so he was maybe on the 6-1 flight, And so the next day, he was going to be on the 1-1 flight. He was scheduled that way because he generally knew where the guy went down. And you didn't know during the night whether the guy had been captured, killed, what would happen. So what you would do the next morning on that 1-1 flight is you would go over the area where this guy was last seen. You'd hit the afterburner in the F-100, and it was a hard light, J-57, kaboom. And it was going to wake somebody up if he was asleep, fatigued, or whatever. You would hit the afterburner, and then you would keep going. And it was the sweetest sound in the world when that guy would come up and say, Misty, this is Buick 2. I'm still here. And then you would go, Buick 2, rescue forces on the way. And then you would go to work, try to kill the guns around there so they could get a helicopter in and rescue the guy. Those were some of the most gratifying missions.
My experience, unfortunately, I was involved in 2 SARs, and both times I was the non-pilot that was there the day before, so I was 1-1 the next morning, and both times they never came up. So that's a very hollow feeling. You're looking for a guy, and the guy, one case was flying in front, other case in the back, said that's right where he went down. And you come up, peep for a voice, and nobody comes up. It's a very empty feeling. It was interesting. There's a thing we used to call the missing Misties, where a Misty flight would disappear. And I don't think we ever lost an airplane doing the VR. The VR up the road, the visual reconnaissance was 40, 50 degree bank, looking at the road, 4 Gs. As you came across the road, you unloaded back the other way, 4 Gs, and you went up the road, and it moved the airplane around enough that I don't remember anyone getting hit in VR, the visual reconnaissance. But where we got at was you have young aggressive fighter pilots who are told, don't use your strafe unless you have to. And it's for some reason, almost every flight came back with no strafe left. So when you find something and you call Hillsborough to bring an airplane in to hit it, and they couldn't get there, they didn't have time. So to keep the truck from getting away, I'm convinced a so-called missing, and this is a phenomenon. I was a Laredo fact, like I said the second time, we lost 2 airplanes and 3 guys in 2 months, and both the same way. They go in low level, being aggressive, straight, get hit, and disappear in the jungle. That was a sad way, and it was always from being aggressive at a time that there was no one there to watch what happened.
This coordination, you get 2 people front and back. How important was the pairing in each jet?
It was very important, but you didn't fly as a formed crew like we did in the F4s. You know, you kind of rotated. There were guys that you liked to fly with more than others, but the guy in the back he had a map book, and so when you found something, he was supposed to figure out where the coordinates were of what you found, so you could report that to people, and the inbound fighters could find you and this sort of thing. Yeah, you know. One day I was flying with a guy, a really experienced F-100 guy. He was having a tough day that day with the maps. And you, as a Misty, you wanted to give this mystique. You were really something. You know, you had your act together, you knew everything. You gave the 9-line brief, and by God, you never changed it. You know, I mean, even though the coordinates you gave may have been 10 miles off, nobody knew anyway. So you give the briefing. And when it's all over with the briefing, you say, I'm going to mark this thing, hit my smoke. You know, that's right where it's at. Well, sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. But the mystique came from the briefing you gave to the fighters to give them the compass. Got a couple of thud guys down there, Jim Hannum, Dick Guiled, classmates of mine. They also, Dick had an F4 tour. The idea was we were trying to impress these guys with the fact that we knew what the hell we were doing. So this particular day, I got this guy in the back seat. He gives the 9-line brief. I'm talking the flight, we're at 12,000 feet orbiting. When you come in, I want you to be here, dear, and all that good. And all of a sudden, this guy in the back punches the mic button and says, I want to correct those coordinates, Okay. So, that we're still waiting for these guys to come in. And he does it again. And I finally told him, I said, Cass, if you push that goddamn mic button one more time, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And when we got back, I gave him the Prince Henry the Navigator Award. He never did that again. Anyway, we had a lot of fun.
In Misty, I worked with F-105 studs twice. Once, Wells Jackson and I were up there, and there was a fog coming off the Bat Lake down the road. And Wells says, this is just like these guys to put a SAM in there when we can't see them. So we're going to go up the road. I said, yeah, we're going to go up the road. And so I came down to get under it, and we're going through about 800 feet, and I'm still not under the clouds. So I pulled off, and Wells goes, what's the matter with you? I got the camera already. And we had these little 35 millimeter Nikon cameras to prove what we said was that air was actually there. So I said, well, I need to get going a little faster, Wells, if we're going to go through this. So we went through there. I don't know how, as fast as it would go. Going up the road, I would say we're about 500 feet. And he takes a picture, and it was at Sam, and we pull up into the clouds and pull off. And so we mentioned at Hillsborough, we've got a SAM site that they're trying to put up. And I forget where the coordinates were. And 2 F-105s come. And we briefly said, listen, guys, we can't mark this because there's not enough time between market and you said, when I say now, we're right over it. And they got the typical one of, yeah, good, let's go. So we go down there and we fly right over it. And I said, now, and they hit it. And we all three pull up through the overcast and look back down there. And did I actually see them hit that, Sam? No, but something sure rocketed out through the clouds pretty fast, so we gave him credit for the Sam. The other time I worked with 105s was in Laos, and going down the trail, we found that they had bent trees over to camouflage. And that way, one of the giveaways with camouflage was if they camouflaged the truck the night before, the leaves were, for want of a better word, a little dead. So they weren't as green as the other leaves, so they figured that out and they bent leaves over it. And we were taking some 23 millimeter out of there. And we gave the 105s a brief, and he said, what'd you say was in there, Misty? Guy in the back goes, 23 millimeter. We pee on that stuff. So he went in and took out the trucks for us. So those are my 2 105 stories.
You think about the most memorable sorties that you have, and I think at Misty, there were a lot of great days and some days that weren't so good. The same guy that I presented the Prince Henry the Navigator Award to got shot down. And I happened to have been, I was probably about 50 miles away up the trail. And I almost imagined that I heard this Mayday call, but it was enough that a turn punched off the tanks and started. These guys had taken a hit. They were going to have to get out of the airplane. They were trying to get to the water. And we didn't have radar on the 100, so we're dead reckoning to try and make a rejoin. And we had them in sight when they punched out of the airplane. And the one guy came down on the top of a hill. And so he was fairly secure. The other guy, when he was coming down, was getting shot at from the ground. In fact, took a round up through his helmet visor. And he had been shot down 2 weeks before. And so we spent a lot of time. There was an Army helicopter actually came in and picked him up and got him out of the danger area. Meanwhile, the other guy's on the top of the hill. And this guy was a hardcore guard guy. And he decided that he was always going to fight his way out. So when he walked out and got in the airplane, he was like a 5-position automatic weapon sight. He had guns sewed into his parachute harnesses and all this kind of stuff. And so he's up there on the top of the hill and he's not talking to us. And, but eventually we get a helicopter to come in and try and pick him up. And his harness is hung up in the trees, but he won't let the harness go because he's got all these guns in it. And, I'm trying to talk to this guy and it's not working very well. But the fact of the matter is we stayed with him longer than we should have. And I was very, very low on fuel. And I started talking, coming up, telling the airborne command and control folks, hey, look, I'm going to need a tanker. I'm going to need a tanker. And it was an overcast. We were working underneath it. And I kept yelling, I'm going to need a tanker. And finally, when they got this guy off the top, I asked for a vector to a tanker, and I turned west. And when I came up through the clouds, I just had a windscreen full of tanker. This tanker guy had left the track against all rules and regulations, and he had come over, and he had, using directional finding, figured out where the hell we were below the clouds. And I'll tell you, another 4 minutes, and we'd have had 2 more guys on the ground. But it was an example of the way folks really worked together to try and do what was needed to get Americans off the ground.
So 16 pilots at any time in the squadron, right? 16, Misty?
Yeah, normally about 16. In March of '69, we were very low on pilots, so I got to fly a lot. And I had 101 hours of F-100 time by the 27th of March.
Oh.
And so after that mission, Arnie Clark was with me. We were flying. The squadron, the commander said, okay, Arnie, take him to Udorn, Thailand, dump him off, and we'll go pick him up next month when he can start another flying time kind of thing. I went to Udorn, and that's where the AB-CCC, the Airborne Command and Post airplanes were. They were C-130s. And I had never been on one, and I wanted to experience it. So I ended up flying on that AB-CCC. So in March of 1969, I logged 115 hours of combat time. And the tragedy is today, our guys aren't getting that kind of stuff in a year, Yeah. But that was just the pace that we went. There's a famous, sort of infamous picture of the Misties of my generation. And, we're standing there. On the left-hand side is the DO of the wing, 37th Wing. It was Colonel Bill Creech, later became 4-star Commander of Tactical Air Command. Beside him was Major Tony McPeak, later became 4-star Commander of PACAF, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Standing next to him is Captain Ron Fogelman, later became 4-star Commander of Air Mobility Command, Commander-in-Chief, Transportation Command, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. On the other end was Colonel Leroy J. Banner, who was the wing commander. He retired as a 3-star. He led the Sante Prisoner of War raid. In between there, we had an astronaut. We had 3 other guys who made general, and that was just one generation. So when you go back and you say, why did you go? You're not sure why you went, but it attracted a certain group of people. And if you look closely at that picture, you're going to see a couple of the guys are standing there with 1,000-yard stares. They've been run hard and put away wet. That was my generation of guys.
So I can only imagine how tight you got. So that's 16 when you're fully manned is not very many people in a fighter squadron. So you must have gotten really tight. How was camaraderie, and how did that camaraderie actually affect you through the losses and through these really grueling days where you're flying your butt off?
I better jump in first, or he'll tell a story when he got out of jail.
I need to hear that one.
Oh, sure you will. It was a very, very tight group. And I think I look back at when we look at friendships that develop then, where you look at like Ron's, we knew him when he was just Fogel person, because we didn't want to offend him. We knew Tony McPeak when he was Tony. We knew Roy Bridges when he was just one of us. So we knew these guys and we respected them for each other. Nobody ever in that outfit bitched about, I just flew yesterday. Nobody ever said, I don't want to go back to whatever was on the board. They put on the flight suit and they went and did it. Now, back on the base, things got interesting because we own Phuket. The Phuket bars are owned with the Misty packs. Everyone else welcome. And we dominated the pool table. We had the front rows whenever the USO shows came by. That's what dragged me into it. These guys are running the show. I want to be part of the big team here. And I remember one of the fellows that it's in that picture that General Fogelman was talking about. I was in his back seat one day, and I won't tell him because he's far too distinguished career for me to ruin it with this. But he said, Rosie, I'm just going to descend at 0.9 Mach. We're on downwind. I'm putting maps away. That sounds okay. Well, an F-100 at 0.9 Mach, when you're going through 2,000 feet, everything on that airplane is shaking. We're indicating close to 600 knots. And he enters downwind and goes to idle speed brakes, and we still went about a mile past Phuket before he got us slowed down. But he's another guy who went on to do very amazing things, and I'm just proud to be a part of that group.
This is a story out of, every now and then I don't know whether it was in fact pressure, you feel up. You didn't want to demonstrate this by refusing to fly or any of that kind of stuff. So every now and then you'd get somebody would decide you were going to go to the club and do something. So on this particular night, we decided we were going to break every glass in the club. Now this makes no sense. I mean, why the hell would you do that? Well, it was a goal. It was an objective. So we started breaking glasses out in the dining room, in the bar, went back in the kitchen, and the bartender he was a friend of the Misty. He said, you guys probably ought to get out of here because somebody's called the security police. Okay. So we had our own compound where we lived in these trailers where there was one guy in one end, Latrine in the middle, other guy. But we had our own little compound. So we go down there, and our commander decided that, well, maybe we ought to have some fireworks. So he started taking these pen gun flares and shooting them up in the air. Well, the next thing we know, we're surrounded by the security police. And the security police guy comes up to our commander and says, sir, that when we put augment keys out on the fence at night to check for infiltrators, that the signal is to fire a pen gun flare if there's somebody coming through the fence. We didn't know that. So the commander's apologizing while he's got these pen gun flares in his hand. Says, it won't happen again. So we go to bed, and the next thing I know, I get called. The commander and a couple of lieutenants are up in the central security. They've been arrested. So I go up there to see, and I don't know why the hell they called me. I was just Joe Bag of Donuts. I was the Misty chaplain, which that's another story. Anyway, I go up there, and the commander's there, and these two lieutenants, and the commander's telling the master sergeant who's on the desk, he said, if you think the wing commander is going to come down here over this little incident, you're out of your room, can't shut. Wing commander's there. He gets the story. He turns to the commander and says, you are fired. You will be off my base by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning if you have to walk out through the gate. Wow. So in the meantime, we take the lieutenants back. Well, we discovered that what had happened is after the rest of us had gone to bed, these guys figured out that it would really be fun to get in the commander's jeep, run around the perimeter, and fire pin gun flares, just to keep the cops limbo at night. So they eventually trapped them in the watch plant. And watch plants and pin gun flares don't mix real well. So anyway, that happened. The commander was gone. But the next day in the afternoon, wing commander calls us into the conference room, and he's got the chief of security police there. And it'll date you, but how many of you out there remember a song, Alice's Restaurant?
Okay.
Remember Alice's Restaurant, Arlo Guthrie? This was a scene right out of Arlo's, out of Alice's Restaurant. So we're in there. Chief of Security Police is up. He's got a pedestal. He's got these 8x10 glossies. This was the officers club. This was this. He's going through all that. Wing commander's up there. He's not happy with us. He says, the officers club is off limits to all Misties until further notice. Okay. And as he walks out, he said, there's going to be 5 letters of reprimand for this. Okay. So one of the guys, Prince Henry, the navigator, walks up to the chief of security police and says, any chance we can get some of those 8x10s? Didn't go over real well. But anyway, so life goes on, and it's about a week later we get called in again, and we had just switched from being up doing the stuff in the north into Laos, and so it was new territory, and the whole effort, all the fighter wings in Thailand and everything, they're all coming over there, and we're supposed to be trying to find targets for them. And the wing commander said, hey, I just got back from a commander's conference down at 7th Air Force, and they're upset, they're not finding targets, and so we'd really like you guys to go out there and sort of find some targets, press a little bit. So we understood that. We went out, and we were finding targets. We were flying below what had been the minimum target, level, and you could look under the trees and see things like that. But in the next 2 weeks, we lost 2 airplanes. We got the crews out, but we lost the airplanes. So the next thing that happens is the wing commander calls us in again. He says, look, you guys did everything I asked you to do, but I'm going to have to ask you to back off a little bit because we can't afford to lose airplanes at that rate. And so I want to thank you guys for that. And as he's leaving the room, he says, oh, by the way, the club's back on limits to the Misties, at which Prince Henry, the navigator in the back, just loud enough for you to hear, said, who the hell wants to go to a club that doesn't have any glasses? So, there was no peace to be had at this ground, So, anyway. So we did things like that, and we're kind of stupid, childish, but
So fun.
took the pressure off.
So fun.
That Prince Henry he's talking about was a guard cube, which I became a guard cube after 9 years of active duty. And the commander of Misty at that time was a guardsman named Clyde Seiler from the Colorado Air Guard, who was a 707 captain to Western at the time, and yet he went and volunteered to be with a group that came over there, and he volunteered to be with Misty. And when we were called for the incident with the pin gun flares, Seiler looked at me and said, I'm going in first, because Creech said, I'll take it one at a time. He said, I'm going in first. I said, yeah, fine. He said, you got a career. You're an academy grad. I'm a guard cube. I'm not losing anything. And when I went in there, Creech was gone. And Clyde took the whole rap. When he called his squadron commander and said, we knew you'd never make it. We expect you to fail anyway, so I'll get back down at Wits was their way of teasing him. He went down, and 2 or 3 days later, pulling out of a low angle pass, a wing keel. And that's been with me the long time.
Yeah, Clyde Seiler didn't make it home. And years later, I met his son, who was also in the Colorado Guard, was not a flyer, but he was a great commander. Really is.
So you lost 30 airplanes over the course of the Misty days. The losses were significant, and you got through that with great antics, a lot of camaraderie and the likes. But one of the things that you may not know about both of them is these two gentlemen were both shot down as Misty Facts and both recovered. Would you take a couple of minutes to talk about the mission and then the extrication?
Well, actually, I was shot down before I went to Misty, and you were shot down after you left Misty. But the fact of the matter is, in the history of the organization, we had 155 pilots total over the basically 3-year period of time that we're there. 44 of that 155 were shot down, either as Misties or before or after. So that's 28% of the crowd. So you knew going in that, you know, it was going to be a little bit different kind of operation. In my case, I got shot down way down in 4 Corps, which was really bad guy country in Vietnam. There weren't any U.S. forces down there. It was an area that had just kind of been ceded to the Viet Cong. But yet we would go down, and there were Army operations in the area. And I got shot down because of stupidity. I mean, one of the things that you learn very early in the fighter business is you never try to duel with a gun. Because think about this. This guy's sitting down there on the ground. He sees you all the way up around there. He's stable. And now you're going to roll in, coming down the chute, 400 to 450. You're trying to find him. You're trying to put your gun on him. You're trying to strafe him, and then you're going to pull off. Meanwhile, he's just sitting there watching you. And he's got you, you know. So I found myself in one of those situations where I decided to duel a gun, and I came out on the short end of it. I punched out, and I didn't punch out immediately. I actually thought I could maybe make it to the water, but eventually the airplane caught on fire, and I ejected. And the first thing that happened was my parachute didn't open, and it should have opened because of the way it was configured. But I had been a skydiver, and that wasn't a big deal, so I got the chute deployed. But I had this absolute fear of drowning. So here I am, coming down, and I am deploying every flotation device I have. Bay West. There goes the raft, you know. So in the meantime, I'm kind of floating right back across the area where I'd been shooting. It wasn't a good thing. I got on the ground, got rid of all my flotation gear, and I was in a rice paddy. I started running down the rice paddy, and I suddenly, there was a kid come up out of a spider hole, and I literally went to get my pistol. I used to carry my pistol Western style, and this kid disappeared, and it just kind of smacked me in the side of the head and said, "This is stupid." I turned around, and I could see my boot marks. So in spite of my fear of drowning, I jumped into a canal, got back under a bank, and you know, by now I'm doing the John Wayne stuff. I'm putting mud on my face, trying to do. So it went on. It one of these things where they pretty well knew where I was. They started coming after me. There was a flight came in, strafed these guys. They backed off. And eventually, there's the FAC calls me and says, "Hey, we've got a 2-ship of Army gunships will come in, and they're willing to come in and try to pick you up, but there's no room on the inside. You're going to have to ride on the outside." You know, I'm 26 years old. I have a flat belly. I'm invincible. I'm flying in support of the Army every day, and they're not going to let me in their helicopter. You got to be shitting me. And so, you know, I'm armed. And, but I said, you know, okay. So they come in, and when they arrive, I see 2 of the skinniest helicopters I've ever seen in my life. They're Cobras. You know, got a gunner and got a pilot in the back and nothing else. So they come in and land, and I couldn't make myself stand up to go out there because there had been a guy shooting at the FAC from the bank behind me, and I just figured I was going to get shot. But anyway, eventually I do. I go out, and there was about 18 inches of water in the patty. I sit on the skid, grab a hold. The gunner who was in the front pops his canopy, shakes his head no, points to a couple of buttons. I push those, and the gun bay door falls down. Now it's about 15 inches wide, and it's about 30 inches long, two cables. So I put my leg back through one, grabbed the hold of the other, and they flew me 20 miles to a special forces camp. It was a great ride. I think they had to replace the door because I might have crimped it a little bit. But anyway, that was my rescue experience. I don't know what yours was like.
I've been flying with Al Winkleman, who was another Misty, and we returned to the squadron. So we're now, like I said, been a flight lead for 4 months. So we were picked because of our experience in Misty to lead flights on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and escort DC-130 gunships at night. So we've done several of those, which was really pretty scary mission, I thought. And we got tasked to do a strike mission in Sun Valley, the out-of-country flights at Phuket were named Sun Valley. We're going to hit a truck park just north of Saravane in Laos. And we came in and circled, and I rolled in. And as I rolled in, I released the 2 outer bombs, and I felt, it was just like someone banging on the bottom of the airplane. And the guy behind me later said, they shot off your pylon where the bomb had been. They shot off the left wing tank, and they must have hit all the hydraulics because I did a hard. And Misty, as soon as you release, we jigged hard one way and then back the other way. And it seemed like all the lights came on, but the flight control light got attention, or the hydraulic light. And you had 2 hydraulic systems. One was the utility that worked the gear and the flaps and everything. And the other one was just flight control. So I looked up, and the flight control system was dead. And I thought, thank God, I've got the big system left. I went over to that, and the needle's going just like this. And that went down to 0. And I remember thinking, well, I've still got flight controls. I should go, and the stick freezes. And meanwhile, all the hydraulic fluids caught on fire, so there's fire streaming out the back of it. Guys are going, bail out. And I saw the 2 bombs go off, and I'm thinking, probably not a great idea to come swinging down in the parachute right where he just bombed these. How you guys doing? Everyone's sorry about the bombs. So I turned around and headed east. One thing we took a lot of pride in Misty was when people came to pick us up, they usually didn't have to kill guns. We usually stayed with the airplane long enough to get someplace safe. So the F-100 had a slab in the back that would freeze in a position where at a certain airspeed, you would continue to climb. So I continued to climb. I ruddered up on a wing to get the nose through the routers and ruddered back down, cleaned the wing off, and started this climb eastbound. And about 20 minutes later, I'm going through 23,000 feet, and all of a sudden, Al, who is tucked in tight, watching me, and he's going away like this. I said, "You're on fire again, Rosie." And I thought, well, I guess I better get out of here. And it's sort of a joke in the 100. The instructions for ejecting were on the canopy. And number 1 was cinch your seatbelt. Number 2 was sit up straight in the seat, put your feet in the stirrup. Number 3 was raise the handles, which blows the canopy, and there goes number 4 and 5 instructions out the window. So you better have them memorized, was the thing. But the thing that's always amazed me about that, psychiatrists, psychologists, whichever I need to visit, will tell you your mind can't absorb things at the rate they're happening, so it slows it down. And I remember squeezing the handles, and nothing seemed to happen. And so I squeezed them again, and all of a sudden the seat, it didn't. I remember seeing the attitude indicator, the windshield go down, the top of the glare shield, the top of the windshield, and I'm sitting there looking into the cockpit. And I remember the guy Ron's talking about, we call him Bullet Bob Bryant. Every time the Air Force gave him an airplane, he jumped out of it, it seemed. And I'm looking down in there, and he had told me at one of these, when we're talking, that you'll tumble real hard when you come out. And I thought, well, I'm not tumbling. This isn't bad. And whoa, I tumbled. Now, everything I just described happened in a second. And I'm looking down at the seatbelt, and I was at 23,000 feet. So I said, thank God I came to 23,000 feet, because the seatbelt's not open. Well, I'll give it a while. Nothing. So I'm just reaching down to undo the seatbelt, and like in slow motion, you see this seatbelt go like that. If it happens at all, it happens 1 second after you pull the trigger. And then I remember thinking the kicker isn't working. Well, finally, I always expected the kicker would be like throw me away from the seat. It just sort of peels the seat off you, and the seat flies away. So now I'm at 23,000 feet with no parachute undeployed, and I again go back to talking to Dave Jenny, who was a skydiver, and he'd been out with a senior ranking guy, and they got hit. And on the way to Da Nang, Dave said, well, sir, we might have to consider bailing out. Boom, out went the back seater.
Oh, no.
So Dave said, well, he's a very high-ranking guy. I can't leave him in the water. So Dave, boom, he jumps up. And he skydived from 16,000 feet. So I'm thinking, well, I might as well try that. Can't be that hard. Fogelman can do it, So all of a sudden I'm spinning real fast. And I just said, God, get me out of this, and I won't screw with it again. And I just wound up falling head first, feet up in the air, and went on down into the jungle that way. One interesting thing, you remember, all of you who've been through survival training, they say don't reach for the helicopter, because I was it took the helicopter guys 11 minutes to cut me out of the trees. So I was pretty shook. I held on to this guy, and we come in, they close the door, we're laying on the ground in the helicopter, and he goes, you can let me go now, Lieutenant. We got you. And I'll tell you, I still got the names of those 4 guys home on the wall, and they stayed there hovering. It was it wasn't the giant, it was the CH-3, the smaller Sea Jolly. And they stayed hovering into the red, because they're at like 4,500 foot altitude, but they would leave me. And when they finally got me clear of the trees, they started moving before we got in, because he had to cool the airplane down. So again, one last thing, we got to Da Nang. I'm sitting laying down on the side, and he says, you want to walk out, sir? Or you want us to carry you? He said, I'll walk out. And I said, what's all those good-looking women over there? He said, well, that's the Pan Am crew. They just came in to see who we rescued. I just went, why don't you carry me? So it took out. I got all my greetings. The hero coming out of the jungle, and that ended that day. Good to be home.
Talking about the parachute thing, go ahead. When I ejected, we had a system, where you had a lanyard in a seat belt, and if you were below, 10,000 feet, the seat was supposed to automatically, as it went away, it would deploy the chute. And in my case, it didn't happen. But again, as a skydiver, I was cognizant of something that happened. I was below 10, didn't have a chute. All I had to do was pull the ripcord, which I did. But later, we got to analyzing why did the chute not open? Because in the previous year, we had several cases of guys getting shot up in the 100, and they were coming back trying to recover the airplane. And at low altitude, something would happen where they were going to have to get out, and they were ejecting, and their chutes weren't open. So we had several fatalities like that. And so we started analyzing what had happened to me. And at that time, the survival radios had the batteries were very poor. It didn't last a long time. I don't know about you guys, but we would sew extra batteries onto our vest. And so going through this sequence that Rosie went through, as I went up the rail, when I cleared the canopy, the air hit my body, and it inflated. It got behind those batteries and pulled that vest away from me. Well, the weave in the vest was so big that when you were sitting in there with the weight of the batteries, it got down and it caught that release on the seatbelt. And so as I went out, the gold key went away and the automatic chute went away.
Wow.
And so as a result of analyzing that, we figured out what had been happening to these guys getting back. And within about 30 days, we had a new survival vest with a much smaller wing. That was kind of it's one of those things. For remembering that, I was awarded an Air Force Commendation Medal. That's what I got out of my ejection, was an Air Force Commendation Medal. Should have had my ass kicked.
It's interesting. We used to say the best airplane to do this job and would be the RF-4. And we thought that because you could take a picture of what you're going to do. If you could somehow put rockets on the thing, you could shoot them and then come back and take a picture. Well, the second time around, that word filtered down, and there was an outfit at Udorn called Atlanta, which was part of the 614th. The guy named Wally Cox, I think, ran it. And you would escort the first Atlanta, who would make runs on all the roads in North Vietnam, that would go back to Udorn. And the second Laredo out had that picture in his lap, and you would look down and say, and the photo guys would say, "There's 2 trucks there." You would not know that if they hadn't done. So that things had improved. Another thing, I give great credit to the leadership of the Air Force. We had 3 very big minuses in Vietnam. We couldn't see anything at night. We had bad accuracy, and we were too visible radar-wise. And we tried in Misty with it was called a starlight scope. And the starlight scope I did with a guy named Steve Amdor. I was in the back seat that night. We're trying to work this. It's a huge piece of equipment. You had to put it over, look through it, and then try to find something. Meanwhile, he's pulling 4G, you go back over, and you go back over this way, and you have to bring it back over. When you think of what happened in those 10 years to where it just came night vision goggles, and they could see them. So that was a big improvement, and I can't say I was in on the ground floor. I can remember telling Steve we need more gas. I said, "We only been here 20 minutes. I said, either gas or go up back here because they're moving this thing around in the dark, trying to see out of it." Now those 3 improvements, you guys did a good job.
I know this is probably running long, but people ask me why I stayed in the Air Force so long, and the fact of the matter was I was a history major, so I had no marketable skills, and so I had to stay where somebody would pay me for doing that. But for a couple of years I taught air power history at the Air Force Academy, and building off of what Rosie just said, air power in Vietnam was not nearly as effective as it could have been. And the reason it wasn't is because the enemy had sanctuaries. Now, the first sanctuary that they had was political. It was the political sanctuary where we could not strike the Northern Railroad. We couldn't strike the port at Haiphong. You're always going to have some kind of political sanctuaries, but one of the rules is you cannot give your enemy a sanctuary. That's what we're screwing up right now in Europe, but that was a political sanctuary. The other sanctuary they had was night, because we just didn't have the capability to be effective at night. Another capability that they had was foliage. We didn't have, at that time, the right stuff to penetrate foliage. Another one that they had was the most powerful integrated air defense system that the world had seen since the Second World War. And so we were trying to fly into that, and the guys up north were doing a tremendous job, but it was a tough chore to do that. And then you had the weapons accuracy issue. And so you had night, weather, foliage, integrated air defense, political sanctuaries. I will say this, that when the Vietnam War was over and we got into the late 70s, in the 1980s, the United States Air Force leadership went to work to do away with the sanctuaries that were within their capability. I was not part of that Air Force leadership at that time. I was just out there being Joe Bag of Donuts, flying great fighters. But if you think about what they did, the first, if you look at integrated air defense, stealth was the thing that they developed during that period of time. If you think about foliage, we ended up with millimeter wave radar kinds of things. If you think about night, that's when we ended up with infrared, with low altitude night infrared navigation, lantern pods, night vision scope. We had all of that. And you ended up with accuracy. We started using precision guided, first with lasers and then GPS and these kinds of things. And so during the 1970s and 80s, the United States Air Force went to work to do away with those sanctuaries. And the Air Force that went to war in the first Gulf War blew everybody's minds because those things had been developed and nobody thought about it. And so what you end up with is you go into the Gulf War. As we started going into that Gulf War, DOD shipped 50,000 body bags to Southeast Asia. That's how they thought the casualties were going to be. But what do we end up with? We end up with an air war that basically goes for 17 days, breaks the back of Saddam Hussein's military, and then we have a ground war that goes for 3 days, and we had less than 300 total casualties. That's the result of people in the United States Air Force, in our military, in our industrial people working. That's why technology, advancing technology, is so important. So we're looking at things today that we never thought about before in terms of space-based capabilities. We're thinking about all of the cyber stuff that's coming down the road. That's what's going to make us effective as we go forward. But we need money and we need leadership to do that. End of speech.
You're going to stay on this soapbox, all right? You can stay up there. I love it. So we got time for one more story, and both of these gentlemen have multiple distinguished flying crosses, DFCs. If you go back into your Misty days, Valor seemed to be part of the culture. It just was part of you. Setting aside your sorties where you ended up jumping out of an airplane, is there one sortie that stands out in your mind above all others?
Can I jump to an F4 story?
Anything you want.
Third DFC was for an F4 sortie during Linebacker 2. We were out of Udon, I was leading a flight for F4s. It actually was only 2 because I was Buick lead. My backseater was Buick 2. Andy Fornow, who was a buddy from F100s, was Buick 3, and his backseaters were because the maintenance could keep up with what was going on. The reason I want to tell this story is because we always made light of the B-52s with fighter pilots. They're sitting at 40,000 feet, having a box lunch, going to war. But I saw what happened over Hanoi during the Christmas raids, and those guys just kept coming. They took horrendous. The first I came off tanker on the first night, and I only did 3 sorties that week because of other work. There were guys that were doing 3 sorties a night. Came off the tanker the first night, and a B-52 blew up, and it looked like a star. And as this wreckage was coming down, other SAMs were coming up at it. And they came back the next night, and the next night. And finally, there was somebody, and this was known, I didn't know this until I read the book. They were planning the raids out of Omaha. And the second day, they were so far behind, they just said, do what you did last night. But these guys still kept coming. And they didn't hesitate. And finally, there was someone at Utapau who said, wait a minute, we can do this smarter. And it was about the 4th or 5th night where they crossed 6 sticks of B-52s over downtown Hanoi in about 4 minutes. And the guys, we both know guys that were POWs, but obviously they said you couldn't hold on, that thing was shaking so bad. And so that night, going back, I just want to say that about B-52s, but we're coming into the area, and the back Red Crown, who was our intercept, says, we have a blue Bandit. I think I've got this. Blue was MiG-21s, which is Bullseye, Hanoi, 240 for 20. And the guy, Danny in the back says, well, I've got him on the radar. And I go, holy cow, he's locked up. And so I could see the afterburner, and so I just gave him some room and came in behind him, and now we're pointing up like this, and we're going for clearance to fire. And Red Crown wouldn't give clearance because it was afraid the radar would skip to a B-52, which had happened. So anyway, we came back down, we came back around, and through all of this, the guy on my wing was a guy named Andy Fordow, who stayed there, and I'm listening to him in the maintenance debrief, and he's saying that his primary attitude system was off when he came off the tanker. And I said, Wheels, why don't you say something? I said, you were so anxious to go, I couldn't let you go alone. But he knew if he didn't go, that Buick sortie wasn't going to go. So there's a lot of good friends of mine. And Wheels Forno was one of them.
Now, Wills was in my squadron at Venable. So I guess probably a mission that I would pick was one of those where I was in the 6-1 flight, and it was up at Chapone, and it was F4 got shot down that night, and the backseater was up on the radio. So he went down. I showed up the next morning. He came up, and we worked the guns, and we brought in the Sandys. And as the Sandys arrived, the first Sandy Lee, took a 37 millimeter right in the cockpit. You know, remember how those clips would tloomed. And the guy had been my T-37 instructor. I had known, flown with him before. So he's down, and then it just becomes a grueling day of working down guns to be able to get it in there. And I logged six hours of flying time that day, flying till we got the guy out. And as they were coming out in the chopper had taken hits, and the guy started yelling, Misty, find me a clearing. I gotta land. And so I was much higher than him, so I put a smoke rocket into a clearing. And finally, so they put the chopper down in the clearing, and they normally had 2 choppers on a mission, and they brought the second chopper in to pick everybody up and get them out of there. And then ABCCC says, Misty, you're cleared to strafe and destroy the chopper. Wow. This is going to be the greatest gun camera film, that ever existed. So I'm rolling in to strafe this thing, and I hear a beeper. There's another beeper going off somewhere, which indicates either they left somebody on the ground there or somebody else is punched out in the proximity. So I don't strafe, I'm afraid they've left somebody on the ground, and I start VRing on this beeper, and it turns up, it was at that fjord, which is about 20 miles south of Chapone, and there had been an A-10 guy flying, or an OV-10 guy flying up through there, and it just got nailed and punched out. And so we went to work and got him out, and I wanted to go back and strafe the chopper, so I head back up, and I get there, and it's a burning Hulk. They cleared somebody else into it. So that was my 6-hour sortie, and we lost some good people, but we got good people.
Well, what an incredible afternoon it's been. I just want to take a minute to thank you both. Actually, it's not me that's thanking you. It's the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General David Alvin, have got citations of honor for both of you. So if you would be so kind. But thank you very much, sir. So very grateful. Real Fogelman, thank you.
Thank
So
you, Jamie.
really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.